thrilled to moderate this excellent panel of accomplished academicians and influential analysts. And I really like this discussion because I do believe that the link between geopolitics and the economy is a matter that changed drastically with the globalization, and we really need your insight on how we should read the new world. It is not something that we often discuss in our days, not even in the parliament. So the concept of geopolitics is not very often on our tables. The last famous and most famous, I think, geopolitician, Zbigniew Brzezinski, he passed away this year. So I think his legacy is not very easy to continue, or of other geopolitical thinkers. It is maybe because the divisions are not clear anymore. Geopolitics was a methodology with two sides, the geostrategy and the geoeconomy. And in the age of post-Cold War, globalization amended the notion of distance, and the concept of territoriality and sovereignty has been irreversibly weakened. So if geopolitics still exist, they exist in a global setting characterized by a rather postmodern notion of geography. And also economic interdependence has brought new concepts, and it was never conflicting to the concept of geopolitical arrangement. But I actually think it's good for me to start the discussion. We're going to follow the Davos concept. So I'll give you 5 minutes each, and then we're going to have a discussion together. And I might add some comments to what you say, because I have already some questions for you. So I will start with Daniel Gros. He's the director of SEPS, and he will give us an introduction to the issue. If I may add a couple of things, of course you can read everybody's CVs, and they're excellent and very well known, but I have to say he's one of the Euro 50 group of eminent economists, also finished the University of Chicago, so I think his insight would be extremely important, and he has a PhD in economics. And so I think this dimension is critical for geopolitics nowadays. So I will give you the floor.
Thank you very much.
You have a mic already.
You have this one.
What a pleasure to be here. I feel a bit that at least part of the topic of this panel surpasses my competences. As you mentioned, I'm an economist. When I hear people talking about geopolitics, I never quite know what they actually mean. It seems to be mostly impressions of what the national interests of a country are. Sometimes a country can say, I have a small neighbor and my national interest to have good relations with that neighbor, or it can say, my national interest to dominate that neighbor. Geopolitics cannot tell you which choice will be taken, right? So that's why I'm a bit skeptical. Perhaps the one thing I wanted to say at the beginning is that the influence of globalization is vastly overrated. I would say that the destiny of a nation, especially the economic destiny of the nation, is still determined to, I would say, 90% plus by domestic choices. Domestic, political, and other choices. That then determines the way the country interacts with the rest of the world. And also that when one talks about globalization, at least the very word gives the impression that everything is now at a global sphere, a global level. You mentioned earlier that the notion of a distance should become less important. If you look how actually trade flows develop, we don't see that. We see that distance matters very much, and when people talk about the global value chains, if you look close at the data, actually what you see is, yes, there are regional value chains, actually defined by the distance one truck can do in one day, right? So we have a European value-added chain, basically centered around Germany, Northern Europe. You have one in North America and one in Asia. But the notion that everything in the globe is connected and that the butterfly in Yokohama produces the typhoon somewhere else, as I said, this is vastly overrated. If you look at the actual economic interdependence, it is actually at the global level, now looking at, let's say, EU-US and not intra-EU, right? If you look at among the major nations, it is not much different than 20 years ago, with one exception, which of course is China. And I think Carl Bildt talked about that. That is, of course, the one factor. But again, China's emergence came because of domestic political choices, which then allowed it to take advantage of the global market. But the first mover, the first element which changed China was a domestic political choice. And I would say, therefore, that to what you said earlier, that the notion for me of sovereignty is very much intact. That there's no use of saying national policymakers basically are powerless because of globalization. I think it is perhaps the opposite. Globalization gives you many more opportunities, and wise or correct policy choices at the national level can be a lever to actually have more success or more failure when you do the wrong choices. And therefore, I would say globalization is certainly not something which diminishes sovereignty, but perhaps actually is a lever which makes national political choices even more important.
That's very interesting already. So thank you very much for your views. I will not ask the questions now. I'm going to move directly to Luca Jahier. Yes?
Jahier is French.
Jahier, yes. He's serving as the president of the European Economic and Social Committee's various interest groups. I should underline the most important things for this discussion. He has been the president for the Federation of Development Cooperation for NGOs, and also he has worked with development programs mainly in Africa. So I think he understands beyond borders how things are changing. We also have the dimension of demographics. I don't know if we should bring this into this discussion, but I give you the floor, and please.
So thank you so much for this invitation. When I was asked to take part on this panel, I was reacting to say I could be the moderator because with this eminent professor and expert, I could moderate. But after I was told that you will have moderators, I accepted to be only a panelist. I am also, as you were saying, although I study international politics, always a little scared about this issue of geopolitics and so on. So I will not enter more in the analysis because we have already heard also from the previous panel. I want to try to say something more vocal, more, how can I say, active for what we can shape a new geopolitics in the year to come. And I think that if you are thinking to the complexity of the world today, not only from the economical point of view, but at large, I think that the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development could be a driver for shaping a new positive agenda for the world to come, and also for the role of Europe. We are not entering in all the enormous challenge Carl Bildt before has addressed for us, the large picture, very complex of all the external, internal challenges. But I think that this agenda has inside the capacity to deal with, to help us to imagine and to work for a new world, to invest our human creativity, a force of innovation, and also a force of determination to transform the reality that is that we are facing. I think that even the idea that has been long time worked before by the CDO, after also by Eurostat, also about beyond GDP, to invent a new, more large model, also based on the Human Development Index 20 years ago by the United Nations, can help us to consider new perspective for the world development as such, and also to look to a new definition of prosperity and also of well-being that is more than needed today, also to invent a new positive narrative, a new positive vision to deal also with our citizens and to have them on board in a positive mood and not only in a waiting that someone from the high, for the politician, for the big leader can invent their future. And I think that in this direction there is also an enormous possibility for Europe. We all knows, and you invited me also to refer to this quote that the Europe share of global GDP is expected to decline from 25% today to 15% in the next few years. And similarly, our share of the global population will be reduced to 6.5% in 2020 and to 5% in 2050. And if you look to our next very close neighbor, Africa, in the same time, from now to 2050, they will double the population, coming to 20% of the global population. Of course, they are not still, and perhaps they will not be coming from now to 2050, the powerful economy that China has become in such a short time. But they will be the 20% of the population at large, an enormous opportunity for development, but also enormous space for raising problem, for moving population, for clashes, for wars, and for insecurity at large. So, from my point of view, unless the European Union takes rapid action and this global agenda where Europe can play some sort of collective leadership can be the way to respond to these challenges, or the alternative will be to disappear from the new geopolitical order very soon as a space, as an order, or simply to be submerged by other challenges and decisions taken by others. I am strongly convinced that for the EU to be a major player in the geopolitical order in 2030, we must not only deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as we already engaged to do, but we also have to take this as a central pillar to guide our policy in the year to come. I think that could give us a key to play in this competitive with other zone of the world, and I think that a good basis already exists. Perhaps for one time, the decision of the Council last June 2017 were very strong, a good decision to shape a direction for an ambitious plan for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, and I think that can lead us to something really new, also thinking to the next multi-annual financial framework and also to the next working program of the Commission, of the next Commission, not of this one that is already done and in the end of its mandate. And the last thing that I want to say, that in this strategy there are a convergence of all interests. There are not new division of conflict of interest between enterprise and workers, social and environmental, east and west. Of course, in the concrete action there could be division, but the most driver are convergent and positive, and we need this positive convergence to take the responsibility for the future. With this agenda, we can have a good possible future in the new geopolitical and geostrategical order. I think that with other, I see much more divisive and explosive issue in the European agenda. That's for the first.
Thank you very much. So unless we move fast, we cannot be positive, but I do believe we can lead, as you said, EU can lead and move very fast. So you give me a very good opportunity to move to Mary Kaldor, a professor of global governance and director of the Conflict and Civil Society Research Unit at the London School of Economics. And also political science, of course, recently, and the CEO at the Department of International Development funded conflict research program. Let me just say that mainly her books, they refer to new wars. So this already is making things interesting, and she's advising Federica Mogherini. So I think you can update us on what is happening. Is Europe moving fast enough? The floor is yours.
Okay, well, I thought, I'll say a little bit about Europe, but I thought I would make 3 points. And my first point is that I'm extremely unhappy with the term geopolitics. I think that geopolitics focuses on the role of the state and a very old-fashioned conception of power that is based on wealth and military strength measured in numbers of men and numbers of weapons. And if you look at the world through a geopolitical lens, you miss the profound social and economic changes that are taking place in the world today. And you miss, actually, the changing nature of power, which I will say something about. So that's my first point. My second point is that I think we live in a major period of transition. It's a transition between what you might call the US-dominated model of development based on mass production, the intensive use of oil, state interventionism, and a new model of development which hasn't yet established itself, fundamentally based on the revolution in information and communications technologies. And periods of transition are periods when, if you like, there's a mismatch between our political institutions and economic and social changes. Our political institutions were established for the era of mass production, and they don't function very well in this new era, which is partly what explains the widespread distrust. Now, normally what happens in history, what has happened in history in major periods of transition like this, is a geopolitical war. And in geopolitical wars, they're very dramatic ways of changing institutions. They not only change the international hierarchy of nations, but they also change the very nature of political institutions. So if you think about the middle of the 20th century, what the two world wars did was that it allowed the US to displace Britain as the main hegemon, but it also brought about huge changes in the nature of the state, huge redistributions of income, all of which were necessary for the flourishing of the mass production era. Now, my fear with geopolitics is that we talk ourselves into a geopolitical war, which is completely impossible nowadays because military power has become so destructive. Actually, what we're seeing is what I call new wars that Eva mentioned. New wars in places like Syria, Yemen, Libya, large parts of the world. And rather than reconstructing and restructuring states, these are hugely destructive. They're kind of neoliberalism in the military sphere. They're very good at destroying political institutions. They're not very good at constructing new ones. And what it's providing is a very fragmented, decentralized, and yet at the same time globalized world, which is quite alarming in my view. And I think Syria particularly, you've seen the undermining of every norm that was part of the post-Cold War order, whether it's the prohibition on war, whether it's chemical weapons, whether it's targeted assassinations, which is really frightening. So that's my second point. So my third point is, if we go on looking through the lens of geopolitics, I think we can envisage a very long period of human decline. And, perhaps we could call it a new dark age. And I think that's very possible. I don't know who's going to come out on top, but nevertheless, if we go on looking through this frame, and we really need to rethink the nature of power. And in that sense, this is where I agree with Luca. I think the EU, despite all its flaws, all its contradictions, all its problems, is something interesting because it's based on an inside conception of power. What do I mean by that? Well, outside is the geopolitical form of, it's linked to the nation state. The old nation state, outside power was military power and wealth. Inside power is legitimacy, politics, rule of law, power based fundamentally on legitimacy and not on these indicators. And I think the EU is an inside type of power. And in this era where, I don't know whether globalization is underrated or overrated, Daniel, but what I do think is that the interconnectedness that comes from information and communications technologies means all kinds of new connections and new communities, not only national communities, that cross borders, that we have to be able to deal with in some way, and we can't deal with them in military ways, we have to deal with them in terms of a conception based on legitimacy. And, you know, I think a very good example is CSDP, Mogherini's external policy, because that's basically an idea of making the inside move outside, rather than protecting the the EU against external threats. It's all about trying to address conflicts in other places, even though it has lots of weaknesses, lots of problems. Nevertheless, the conception is on the right lines, I feel. So what we need in this new era is both local and global. We need institutions that can address global challenges like climate change, like conflict, like migration, that need to be addressed at a global level, but actually, like financial speculation, but actually in such a way as to allow more flexible, adaptive institutions at local levels. And I think above all, and that's really my final point, we need a different way of framing the challenges we face. So I'm saying, instead of framing them in national and geopolitical terms, we want to move to a different way of framing that allows us to really address the deep-rooted contradictions in our societies.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting, your point of view. So we have basically to create new terms and give them new definitions. It's in your words. So that's very interesting and food for thought. I moved to Guntram Wolff, a director of Bruegel, and also he has been working and advising ECOFIN. So he knows exactly what the parliament is about and how he should let us know what we should do and how we can run faster than the developments and this progress. And he's also an advisor of the International Monetary Fund. So this means his perspective, I think, will close this panel, and then we will have interesting questions. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. So I also don't really know what geopolitics is. So what I thought I would do is talk about 4 major global trends to 2030 and sort of tie them into our discussion. And I think the 4 sort of globalization-related trends that we can think of, so one is migration, one is trade, one is capital flows, and one is technology. And let me start with sort of the migration pillar. I think looking at the migration topic from a European perspective to 2030, the one big defining issue for European policymakers will, of course, be our neighboring continent, Africa. Africa's population by 2050 will go to 2.5 billion. It's now 1 billion. By 2030, I think it will reach almost 2 billion. So the population growth there is enormous. And the notion that some here in Brussels have that now we are going to go to Africa to develop it so that migratory pressures will decrease is, of course, wishful thinking. First, we don't know how to develop Africa. Second, even if we knew, the reality is that as income grows, people are more likely to emigrate, not less likely. So only once they become relatively rich, emigration numbers will actually fall. Before, people will just be able to afford migrating. So I think the migration pressure, both coming from demographics as well as from a gradual development of Africa, will increase, and that will very much shape politics on the continent. Now, the second point is trade. And there I would actually like to echo what Daniel said. Indeed, in the trade dimension, distance matters. And so if you look at trade relations, the United Kingdom, for example, is for the European Union as important as a trading partner as is China or the United States. So if you just look at the gross numbers, the numbers are roughly the same. The exports of Europe, the European Union of 27, to the UK are roughly comparable to what we export to China or what we export to the United States. So clearly, on the trade dimension, it will be extremely important for Europe to have good relations with the major trading neighbors. But of course, the global trade also matters. So it matters how much trade we have with China and what kind of trade we have with China and the United States. So I clearly would also argue that we as Europeans have an interest in sustaining a rules-based multilateral trading system. And I think we should promote that over the next 30 years. Now, the third point is capital flows. Now, if you look at the current capital stocks, yeah, so who owns what abroad, we are basically talking of a transatlantic economy. Okay, so this is a transatlantic economy. The stock of investment between the United States and Europe and the United States surpasses that of the relation between Europe and China by a factor of 10 to 30, depending on how you measure it, or even 50. So the US, the relation with the US, is absolutely crucial. If it goes dire, it will mean potentially significant losses on existing investments. Now, if you look at the dynamics, because we're talking at 2030, of course, China's role will become more important. And China, and I think sort of the big change that happened in the last few years is that so far we've been thinking of globalization, financial globalization, as well, basically Europe and China investing in the rest of the world. You know, we put our FDI into Southeast Asia, into Africa, into wherever, into Latin America. But what has happened since a few years is that more and more emerging economies, including China, invest into Europe, invest into the United States, and that raises a lot of unease about whether the kind of investment that we get follows the same kind of rules that we thought should apply universally, but that may actually be interpreted quite differently. And I think the unease that a lot of Europeans and Americans have about financial flows very much comes now from the fact that, well, it's basically emerging economies investing, and it's basically they start applying different rules of the game than the ones that we have defined in the sort of post-Britain, in the post-World War II period. Now, my last point is on technology, and I think that's perhaps the even most important point, and there I think we should be aware that a lot of what the modern technologies, digital technologies, are based on massive scale, and if you have massive scale, you actually dominate, and you dominate not just regionally, you actually dominate globally. And I think the fact that there's no major digital company in Europe compared to, of course, the GAFAs in the United States, but also China is now entering this race and has entered this race big time, means that, you know, there's basically going to be companies that dominate globally the flow of data and dominate globally the business around these data. And the more you dominate these data, the more advantages you also have in the development of artificial intelligence, which, you know, the development of artificial intelligence is very much based also on the access to large amounts of data. China has done sort of a magnificent experiment by basically closing its borders to digital data flow and basically appropriating all the Chinese data for themselves. And, you know, that gives them basically 1 billion or 1.3 billion individuals on which they can use artificial intelligence in all their develop new technologies and so on and so forth. So it gives them a huge competitive advantage. And I think there the challenge for Europe will be, you know, what is our response? Now, we don't have a single digital market. I mean, we talk about it, but we don't have one. We have very fragmented digital markets. And even if we had one, it would be relatively small, and it is already dominated by other players. So I think it's a space where certainly we as Europeans will have to do a lot of thinking.
Thank you so much. So, mentioning new technologies, which is the subject that I love the most, I'm trying to understand. So, if we remove the term that you don't like, we remove geopolitics. Nobody likes it in my panel. Perfect. I think now
we like global trends.
let's say, global trends and the new global order of new balances among the powers of the world. So if we talk about this, and we would have a new subject now, so it's about the economy basically, and the new interests and the new opportunities and challenges. Could we predict the new challenges and the new wars to be able to prevent them in some cases? Because even though we don't talk about geopolitics, everything now with the globalization can affect us, can affect our economy. Something goes wrong in China, the stock market is collapsing in New York. And if we have the Brexit and Trump, you see rapidly EU is moving towards a European Defence Union. So this changes everything. So we are interconnected, as you very well said. Can we predict the new wars or the new challenges to prevent them? I would give you.
Well, of course we can, but what I was trying to say is that the problem is actually political, not economic. I think the problem is that we don't have political institutions fit for purpose. And if we fail to develop political institutions fit for purpose, what we're going to see is a spread of new wars. I mean, I already see in Britain the rise of hate crime in a very nasty way, particularly among Brexiteers. And I think that's the sort of beginnings, that's what you see in the beginnings of new wars, and we see similar phenomenon in the United States. So until we can establish legitimate political institutions, we can't actually prevent new wars. Who is the we? The we are very dysfunctional nation states, and maybe the EU, as a new type of institution, is the one most well placed to deal with it, but it doesn't yet have sufficient buy-in from the member states, and so that's hugely problematic, I think. And they're facing all these counter trends of right-wing populism and so on, which is pulling Europe apart.
So I think since you have the experience of US, being in Chicago, I think you're visiting often, and things are changing there too. We have hate speech, we had a president that created a kind of a division among the US citizens. Do you think these are interconnected also, and these things would change the way we think of the world, and we have to rethink of our balances and our relations?
I mean, certainly, there has certainly been an element of economic mechanisms in the election of Donald Trump, but I would say it has not been the dominant one. There might have been a feeling in the US that they're losing their exceptional status just because the others are catching up, in China in primis. But if you talk about these famous workers displaced by globalization, the entire manufacturing sector in the United States occupies about 10% of the workforce. And if it had shrunk from 15 to 10 or to 8, that makes 7% of the population. Doesn't get you the 48% which he had, right? So there was much more different going on, right? There was, I think, also a shift in the social hierarchy among different political groups. Famous white males who feel they're no longer on top. So I think these are the things which have been bubbling under the surface. But I must say, when I look at the United States today, I must see civil society has responded in a very strong fashion. And not just, say, atomistic, but also new coalitions emerging. So that you talked about the concept of power. He might be sitting in the White House, but what can he do, right? And what actually has he done, apart from many tweets, right? I have the impression there's a lot of talk about what he says and how unacceptable it is, and maybe that personality delights in that, but when you actually look what he has done, very little.
Well, except for environmental policy, no?
Excuse me?
Environmental policy has done a lot, actually, and unwinding a lot of legislation.
But even there, what has been done, as opposed to the withdrawal, for example, from the Paris Treaty. I mean, you have to take into account that the US was in Kyoto, but Congress has not passed a single act on legislation, right? Under Obama and other presidents. So again, what has really materially changed in actual US policies, I'm not saying zero, but I would say it's much more at the margin.
Okay, though I'm a bit worried now because, you know, with Twitter and social media, don't underestimate it, you can actually change the government of a country beyond US. So I remember of the Arab Spring and how social media started a revolution. So you can maybe create new divisions, and I agree he couldn't pass the legislation, but he made at least Europe, for Europe, he was a good president. We move very fast towards our legislation. We are now suddenly trying to create a more strong union in many things, and as I said, defense, for example. So the same thing with the US. I see China that we think maybe it's very far because of the distance, but I see that with the One Belt, One Road initiative, they are moving aggressively to create this trade zone through Africa towards Europe. And they are trying to get the ports, and they try to have this new trade agreement with all the countries. Not Europe, as you said, Europe is not yet responded, but it's coming. So do you think this policy of China should be something that we should deal with very fast, or you think it would be very slow? It's coming through Africa. They're already there.
I think that China will go even faster than we can imagine, because I remember 15 years ago there was a big Italian economist that was presenting, Mario De Aglio, how China would have become faster. No one was trusting him. He has gone faster twice than Mario De Aglio was expecting or forecasting. So I think they will go very fast, also because they are fully state supported in a way that no other country in the world is state supported from the finance point of view. But what I'm questioning is not what China is doing. What I'm questioning is what the European Union is not doing. Mm-hmm. Because we have an enormous capacity to analyze problems. And we are absolutely the best, and I am an Italian, we are even better than others to make a strong analysis in this issue. But we are our immediate neighbor, that is Africa, that can create to us enormous problem in terms of security, in terms of migration, in terms also of climate migrant. The last figures that has been raised in the G7 in Milano was quite clear. They were speaking about 500 million of refugees climate in the year to come. They will not all come to Europe, but they will create enormous destruction. A continent, 2 billion people in a few years, where the large part will be under 18 years old. So a young continent, full of energy. Why China is investing in Africa since the last 10 years and Europe is not doing the same? I remember 10 years ago, I was chairing a seminar in the South Africa region in Gaborone in Botswana. I was speaking about the two European ambassadors, Germany and France, and asking how much is the volume of external aid, external investment. The large part was coming from Europe. 98% of all the construction in Botswana were in the hand of China. So where are we, European? Why we are not thinking that Africa is the good investment for the EU-Africa partnership for a reciprocal growth for the 50 years to come? Some head of state are thinking in Africa that China is coming, yes, leading investment, but for their profit, the land grabbing and everything else. So this is the real challenge. We are not, and the volume of investment that Europe is doing, also via external aid, is enormous in Africa. Why we are not using in a strategic way, not only to contain today the migration compact, not only for migration, is, yes, also for migration, this immediate challenge, but it's for our long-term security and also the enormous opportunity to think that 2 billion person could be 2 billion consumer, could be 2 billion entering the market. Why China has transformed so many people that are poor in people, the middle class that are in the market, they could not imagine the same for another continent, is totally out of the loop. I think that Europe has the force to do and also to present another model, not only because she has a tradition, a long tradition, the colonial past, but because she has another model of integrating not of imperialistic occupation. That can be the future. And they are our neighbors, so we have an interest to secure and to transform this in an enormous opportunity. I think we can do, but we have, of course, this is more a question not of financial possibility of a strategy, is a question of institutional political will to invest and to have a plan for the 10 years, 15 years to come.
Well, you replied, in Europe we usually have one mandate strategy, 5 years. In China we have like 20, 40 years strategy.
On this, I disagree with you, because Europe has been capable to do a long-term strategy. Think to the Lomé and Cotonou agreement with the ACP. It has been a 30-year strategy. There has been a long strategy. At the beginning it was much more clear. After we have a little lost, we have repeated. So when we wanted, we have been capable to make long-term strategy, not only for one mandate.
So we are capable, but we're not doing this. That's why I think these kind of discussions are important, because we understand we're not doing it, and then we have to run faster to do it. Let me take some questions from our audience, because everybody are excellent being here, that I know some of them.
My question is, it concerns the EU's ability to defend globalization internally, not least. And that is, the benefits of are large, but they're quite concentrated at the upper end. And this has happened, this gives more inequality, and this over the past 20 years has coincided with the period where we went away from the kind of redistributive economic policies of the post-war decades. And so these two things have combined to aggravate each other. And where do we go from there? There's a strong consensus around compensating the losers. And there's a lot of talk about assistance to retrain and to relocate. But do we need to think more in structural terms of reviving and returning to a structural approach towards redistribution as a remedy here? And the problem there is then, does that mean that what can the EU do in this circumstance, or is it entirely up to each individual member state?
Let's get 2 more questions and then we have the answers.
Thank you. My name is Risto Nimen from European Parliamentary Research Service. I have just a question concerning Asia. We haven't spoken anything about India, which will become the biggest country very soon. But my question is that in those countries who have raised people from poverty to middle class, do we have enough economic growth in future to keep them in the middle class, not them falling back to the poverty? Then the second question is that if we can do that, where we can get the resources? If we combine this with this huge population growth which is predicted, for example, in Africa, where we get all these resources, raw material, etc., which will support this growth?
Thank you.
Thank you. Questions to Professor Kaldor and to Mr. Wolff. I think you gave an excellent diagnosis concerning the technological challenge and the migration challenge concerning Africa. What should the EU do in terms of concrete actions to avoid the outcome which we don't want to see? And to Professor Kaldor, do you see any chance for the member states to realize the danger that you describe and the need to transform the political institutions, whether they would be able and willing to do that?
We have one more there. I can take this one for this round.
Thank you. Lars Bruegel, German Institute for International Security Affairs, Berlin. As much, Mary, as I like your analysis, I would still want to challenge you a little bit about therapy. Essentially what you're saying is...
About what?
Therapy. Essentially what you're saying is something like, we need new political institutions, and if we don't get them, it will be a catastrophe. It will be very bad, so to speak. So how do we get at these new political institutions? What could they look like? That would be the first question. Second goes to Daniel. Daniel, when I listen to you talking about the US and what the current president has achieved, somewhat spontaneously, the question occurred in my mind, how important do you think are policymakers for policymaking? So both questions go in the direction, what's the future of policymaking? Any thoughts on that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay, so let's get some replies on your questions. So I will start with you, please.
Yeah, I mean, many questions. So perhaps on the question of, you know, compensating the losers and who should do it and so on. I mean, first of all, I think we should be careful attributing inequalities solely to globalization. I mean, a lot has to do with technological change. And empirically, it's actually not so easy to differentiate the two. But, you know, I would be very careful sort of arguing that the decline in the manufacturing sector in some countries is primarily driven by globalization. I mean, it's probably to a large extent driven by just technological change. Now, then the question is, what can we do to take care of the losers? You know, I tend to think the nation state is still the relevant entity here, and it's the entity that actually has the powers. And there I would probably agree with Daniel, has the powers to do it. I mean, the nation state has the power to tax, the nation state has the power to distribute. We have very large nation states with actually a lot of tax resources. We don't always use them efficiently, so I think a reform of the welfare state, making it more efficient so that money actually goes to those that need it, seems to be, to me, like a #1 priority. We see huge differences across EU countries with the same amount of money being spent in redistribution and very different effects on income in a reduction in income inequality. But, you know, at the end of the day, for all the talk of the social pillar and so on, at the end of the day, it's the nation state. Now, what you can do here is, I think, empower the nation state, and empower the nation state in the sense of making sure that, you know, tax evasion, tax fraud, and tax avoidance is effectively combated. And I think the EU could be much more forceful in these areas than it is currently. Now, then there was a question on what can we do about migration? Well, I mean, this is an impossible question to answer in 2-3 minutes, right? But I mean, I think I just want to say, let's not assume that the topic will go away. There will have to be a combination of measures. One part of it has to do with, you know, increasing and working on political stability in the north of Africa. I mean, that's for sure. A second part has to do with border controls, one way or another. A third part has to do, of course, with integrating the people that arrive into our societies. And so it's the mixture of the three. If you, depending on your political preferences, you will put more emphasis on one or the other. But I think all three will play a major role in the next 20 or 30 years. And on technology, you had a question on technology. That's, again, I think very difficult question to answer. Certainly one important step to me is that, you know, we really make this a single digital market and not fragmented markets. And if you look, for example, at one segment that I recently studied is fintech, yeah, so financial innovation, digital innovation in the financial sector. Well, what we are seeing, basically, we are seeing the emergence of lots of small national players that basically follow national legislation and where we have national regulations of these new players. Well, I think it's not the right approach. I mean, we need to, from the beginning, if we want to develop a fintech sector, from the beginning, do it at a European level. I mean, that's just one example.
Thank you. So when we talk about new technologies, I think this is where I understand decentralization, but globalization at the same time. So if you have some answers, and I would add one question, do you expect more or less economic and institutional convergence, and who would win?
Well, I'm going to answer the questions directly and maybe answer your question indirectly. So let me start with political institutions. The way I think it's useful to think about the European Union is as a model of global governance that taxes global bads and promotes global goods. So not a new nation state in the making, but another layer, political layer, that both empowers the nation states and restrains its worst aspects, namely war and fascism and so on.
Sure.
And so it would, for example, tax carbon,
Sure.
Close down multinational safe havens, tax financial speculation, and promote energy efficient infrastructure, renewable energies, peace, and so on. And the idea is the nation state would continue with income taxes and redistribution, but what the EU would be doing would be empowering that and empowering local levels by closing off the escape routes, as it were, that the rich have not to pay taxes. So that's the kind of layering of political institutions that I imagine. Then migration. I think that migration is here to stay. It's part of the world we live in, and the anti-migration rhetoric has been very political. You know, I feel that the refugee crisis was almost a crisis of our own making. That if we'd accepted refugees, I don't think people would have noticed that much. But by making it very visible, I look at the camp in Calais. I look at the camp in Calais, 150,000 people. We could have closed that camp, integrated all those people in Britain, and no one would have noticed. As it was, we made a big political fuss about it. And I think the key issue for us is not so much how do we control migration, but how do we manage it? How do we make sure that our public services are adequate? How do we make sure there aren't ruthless companies that undercut wages? Those kinds of ways we should address migration. Thirdly, resources. I think if we are to get back into a phase of economic growth and new phase in productivity increases, I think the problem at the moment is that labor productivity increases get harder and harder to achieve, and what we need is resource productivity agreement. If people are going to go on making more and more profits through increased productivity, it's going to be through resource saving innovation rather than through labor or capital saving innovation. And that's where we need to focus. And then finally, the question, not only what sort of political institutions, but how do we get there? Daniel mentioned civil society in the United States. I think we need a lot more, we need a new narrative. At the moment, the dominant political narratives are either the neoliberal global elite narrative or the right-wing nationalist populist narrative. And what we lack is an emancipatory, green, redistributed narrative. And that can only really be constructed from below by groups and movements who exist actually across Europe in many countries, but somehow are more focused on local issues than European and global issues. And yet the kinds of things they want can only be achieved if they become more focused on Europe. We need a much greater responsiveness of European institutions to citizens' demands, and we need more joined up citizens' demands. So it's all about politics and civil society, in my view, and promoting a different narrative.
Thank you very much. So you give us homework for politicians, and it's about time because we're trying to understand how the new party should evolve, because we have big changes with the elections in Europe, in many countries. You see what's happening in France, you see in Germany. So this is a very interesting idea for us to work with. Maybe you should take the burden to answer if India can be a game changer on the new political order. I'm trying to change the title. In the end, I'm going to find the title of this panel.
I wanted to do that by combining it with the question, what is actually the influence of policymakers? Now, let me take the example of Donald Trump. We have a political system which it's known for its checks and balances, which is made to impede rapid changes. And we have elected somebody to the presidency, who we know has very little domestic power, not on the basis of a concrete program what he wants to do and a widespread feeling that something precise should be done, but more a generalized feeling of dissatisfaction and sentiment, right? So he comes in, he produces more sentiment, but no wonder that he cannot change the substance of policy much, mostly in the domestic sphere. In the foreign policy sphere, we know that the president has much more prerogatives, but even there he has been kept on a tight leash, right? So, and that is not a surprise in a society which has this very diffuse power, strong civil society, organizations, and a feeling of support, right? So, doesn't mean that policymakers are powerless. In certain situations, in a crisis, the guys at the top can make important decisions. Let's take in Europe, during the so-called migration crisis, the German government and Merkel in the first instance had to make the choice, do we close the borders or not? And that came in the end almost to a one-person decision. And that, I think, was decisive for Europe. Right? So there are occasions when it boils down to leadership, if you want, but not every day and not over longer term. That brings me to India. What's the difference between India and China? I don't think it's so much Chinese planning. China actually succeeded the old way, right? By investing massively in human capital, by having very good schools everywhere, as opposed to India, where you have states of 300 million of people where the school system is in shambles. They have a population which saves like mad, so they don't need somebody else coming in and build their roads. They're building themselves, and twice as much as they need, just as they are at it, because they have their own capital, they have their own people, and the technology they got from us in a hurry. So I don't think that's such a miracle. But as I said, India doesn't have the first element. It doesn't have the educated population, not in that terms of average quality. It doesn't have the savings. And it doesn't have, and that was the last part of the Chinese, the openness to the rest of the world. These were political choices which were made. Right? They were made at the beginning when India became independent. Do we go for a massive program of primary and secondary education? No. Right? Do we go for radical opening of the economy? No. Don't think these were one-person choices, but they reflected some policy priorities in the country at large. And I think in that sense, yes, policymakers can have a very deep influence on the destiny of a nation, but it's much more a confluence of societal preferences and the institutions which express them, which lead to certain outcomes.
Well, that would be an answer. Yesterday, somebody told me at a panel of new technologies that if we manage to decentralize everything, then we don't need politicians.
I forgot to answer that.
I'll come back to you to answer this question. Maybe we can close with this one. So I will wait for your answer too, to anything that you want.
No, I will not answer to anything that has been told. I want only to underline three issues. One about migration.
You're also in Italian.
Yes.
So you understand the migration flows and how it can change the way that we used to live and everything, and the population and the new challenges.
Or how has been misused by politicians in a sort of a political game, because finally the mass of people has not been so massive to change, except some part of Italy. But about immigration, I want to say one element of fact and one larger consideration in the sense of what Guntram was already saying. The first, taking Italy, 80% of all the work of welcoming, integration, and assisting has been done by churches and civil society and sometimes local community. That's all. With very low transfer from the state or from other stakeholders. In some cases, in some small part, enterprises has been engaged because they were interested also in this workforce. But that has been the reality. So the force of civil society were mentioned, I will come just later on this. But about migration, I fully agree with the 3 points of Guntram. These are the key points. The main difference that another time we need a long-term integrated strategy. We cannot now deal with the frontier. Tomorrow we deal with integration, and tomorrow after with some program in Mali or in Albania or in Liban, and after we forget. We need an integrated long-term strategy that will deal with these 3 elements and will invest together about this issue. This issue was at least absolutely clear when the Euromed process was launched in the Barcelona process that deal, and what we have done during 15 lost years of the Barcelona process, because it has delivered nothing, all the Euromed investment. And the question of dealing about a massive youth population on the south of the Mediterranean, that we have to give responses in a joint investment. So we need, these are the 3 main lines, but we need to have a overall and long-term strategy that integrated the 3 issues: internally, security, and investment for growth and for development. About the issue of welfare, we need huge reform of our welfare system. And I was in Gothenburg, and the pity of Gothenburg is that no quotation was done of one of the most innovative driver of innovation in care and protection, that is the social economy. The day before, there was 11 governments in a side event discussing about this. It's a sector that is providing a lot of innovation and enlargement of welfare system. Another time, starting from the bottom, from civil society, cooperative, social enterprise, local community, and more often banks, foundation, and enterprises to deal, to invent a new system to care and protect and to secure and to make the social balance. These forces are already working. And the third one, I think that in terms of new governance, and there's also one of the 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Agenda, is exactly the multi-stakeholder model of governance that will use also the force of employers, investors, civil society organization, workers, women, youth organization, with local community, with state. We have to take stock. The state has still a lot of role to play, and they have to play, but in a new form of integrated alliance. Europe, from my point of view, more than others, has more capacity to deal with this multi-stakeholder perspective. It can do, but we have also to trust this bottom-up approach, this at least providing answer and possibility for the future.
Thank you very much. And the final word to the lady of our panel.
That's nice of you. Actually, I agree very much with what Luca just said. I mean, the question was on how we do redistribution, and your question on the convergence of technology. I think what the change in technology means is that you can be much more decentralized, much more local, much more blurring of the lines between public and private, consumer and producer, and much greater diversity, actually, according to local differences. But at the same time, you have these standardized global connections, you know, like Windows or Apple or whatever. So it's a combination of the two, and that's the sense in which the national level, although it's bound to go on being important, is less important because the nation state is both too large and too small for the current context in which we live.
Thank you very much. And with this, I think we found the title of this panel. It's New Politics in the New Order. And the next panel should be how can decentralization answer to globalization? So thank you all so much. It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.